Ever heard of a country supplying weapons to its supposed archenemy? Sounds a little crazy, right?
Yeah,
It's like something out of a spy movie.
it does.
But that's exactly what happened between Iran and Israel.
Right.
Today, we're going deep, deep, deep into one of the most complex and fascinating relationships in modern history,
Yeah.
the tangled tale of Iran and Israel.
You know, what's really interesting about this is how deeply intertwined the histories actually are.
Yeah.
Even despite how things are today. You know, we're not just talking about ancient history here either.
Right.
We're going to unravel a narrative that really spans centuries
Yeah,
and directly impacts what we see in the headlines today.
absolutely. And to help us navigate this intricate web,
Mm-hmm.
we have a phenomenal guide,
Yeah.
Mizer Bahari,
Great guess.
an Iranian-Canadian journalist who's had a front row seat to these events that have shaped this relationship.
Yeah, Mazer brings an unparalleled depth of knowledge to this conversation.
So let's rewind the clock a little bit.
Okay.
Imagine a time when Iran was a bustling center of Jewish life,
Mm-hmm.
a place where synagogues stood tall,
Yeah.
and a thriving Jewish community contributed significantly to the country's social and economic fabric.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe, considering where things stand today.
Yeah, you know, it might seem like a distant memory, but Iran's Jewish community has roots that go back centuries.
Wow.
Before the 1979 revolution, an estimated 100,000 Jews called Iran home.
Wow.
They were doctors, lawyers, merchants. They played really integral roles in Iranian society.
So what led to such a dramatic shift?
Right.
I mean, was the 1979 revolution the sole catalyst for this tumultuous turn of events?
Yeah, I mean, the revolution was undoubtedly a turning point. I mean,
Right.
it reshaped Iran's internal landscape and its place on the world stage.
Right.
But even with the rise of slogans like death to Israel, the reality is the relationship remained much more complicated.
Right. Because like every time we peel back a layer of this story, we find another layer of complexity underneath.
Exactly. Yeah. And a great example is the fact that Iran was actually one of the first Muslim majority countries to officially recognize Israel in 1951.
Really?
Yeah. And that stemmed from a period of relatively stable relations during the early years of the Shah's rule.
Okay, so the 1953 coup, though, orchestrated in part by the U.S. and Britain, seems to mark a shift in that dynamic.
Yeah, you're right. The coup solidified the Shah's grip on power
Mhm.
and led him to cultivate closer ties with the West, including Israel.
Okay.
And even though it did cause some friction with some of his Arab neighbors.
So this seemingly straightforward narrative of animosity
Mm.
actually started with a period of recognition and even cooperation.
Precisely, yeah. The Shah's foreign policy was driven by a complex set of motivations, including his fervent anti-communism,
Right.
his desire for regional dominance, and even some of his belief in certain conspiracy theories that painted Israel as a valuable ally against Soviet influence.
It seems almost paradoxical, maintaining ties with Israel while also trying to position himself as a leader in the Muslim world.
Yeah, he often played this delicate balancing act.
Right.
You know, engaging in covert cooperation with Israel while also publicly maintaining this stance of solidarity with Arab nations.
So this is where things start to feel like that spy novel.
Yeah.
So tell me more about this covert cooperation. What did it entail?
Well, I mean, one of the most striking examples is the economic relationship between the two nations that flourished.
Okay.
Iran supplied Israel with a significant portion of its oil needs, while Israel provided Iran with technological expertise and military equipment.
Wow.
And this clandestine exchange continued for years, shrouded in secrecy.
It's amazing to think that these two countries, who are now portrayed as sworn enemies, were once engaging in such a significant level of cooperation, even if it was under the radar.
Yeah, it really underscores how complex this relationship is, and it gets even more convoluted when we look at what happened after the 1979 revolution.
Right, because you'd assume that with the Ayatollah Khomeini's rise to power and his staunch anti-Israel rhetoric, all ties would have been severed. But that's not what happened, is it?
Not at all, and this is where we encounter one of the most surprising twists in this saga.
Okay.
Even after the revolution, and despite the Ayatollah's fiery pronouncements, Israel continued to support Iran.
So you're telling me that Israel, after being denounced as the little Satan by the new Iranian regime, continued to provide support to Iran. How is it even possible?
It sounds unbelievable, I know, but this is a prime example of real politic in action.
Yeah.
Remember, both countries shared a common enemy at that time, Saddam Hussein's Iraq,
Right.
which had become a growing threat in the region.
Ah, so it's the classic case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Precisely. Israel saw an opportunity to weaken Iraq, a mutual threat,
Okay.
by supplying Iran with much-needed weaponry and intelligence during that grueling Iran-Iraq war.
So Israel was essentially arming the very country that was calling for its destruction.
It might seem absurd on the surface, but that's the reality of international relations.
Wow.
National interests often trump ideological differences, especially when strategic goals align.
This just blows my mind.
Yeah.
It really highlights how quickly allegiances can shift based on the geopolitical landscape. So we've gone from a period of covert cooperation to a seemingly paradoxical alliance against a common enemy. Where do things go from here?
Well, as you can imagine, this unlikely partnership wasn't destined to last.
Right.
The seeds of future conflict were already being sown, even as these clandestine dealings were taking place.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. As we kind of dig deeper into this intricate story, it's important to remember that this period of covert cooperation between Iran and Israel wasn't without its critics even back then.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
Yeah.
This raised some eyebrows at the very least.
Right.
After all this was happening during the Iran-Iraq War, a brutal conflict that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives.
Exactly. And it wasn't just a moral dilemma. There were serious strategic considerations as well.
Right.
Some argued that, by supplying Iran with weapons, Israel was actually inadvertently helping to strengthen a regime that was fundamentally hostile to its very existence.
Right.
Yeah.
It seems like a dangerous gamble, to put it mildly.
It was a gamble.
Yeah.
Driven by that very real threat posed by Saddam Hussein.
Right.
But, as the war dragged on and as Iran's revolutionary fervor kind of intensified, the cracks in this fragile alliance began to show.
So what ultimately led to the breakdown of this unlikely partnership? Was it purely ideological, or were there other factors at play?
Well, the ideological divide certainly played a role.
Right.
The Ayatollah Khomeini's regime viewed Israel as an illegitimate entity and a symbol of Western imperialism.
Right.
And this made any kind of long-term cooperation unsustainable.
But it seems like more than just rhetoric was driving this shift.
Right.
Didn't Iran start to pursue its own regional ambitions that put it at odds with Israel?
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Iran began to invest very heavily in cultivating proxy groups across the Middle East, particularly Hezbollah in Lebanon.
This is where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
And by interesting, I mean dangerously complex.
Yeah.
Can you unpack this concept of proxy warfare for our listeners a little bit?
Sure. Essentially, proxy warfare involves supporting and directing armed groups in other countries
Okay.
to advance your own interests without directly engaging in the conflict yourself.
Right.
It's a way to exert influence, destabilize rivals, and maintain a degree of plausible deniability.
So Iran was using these groups as a way to project power throughout the region.
Yeah.
And by extension, challenge Israel's dominance.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And Hezbollah, with its deep ties to Iran, became a really potent tool in this strategy.
But this wasn't just about geopolitical maneuvering, was it? Hezbollah, unlike some other proxy groups, has a deep ideological connection to Iran.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They're both Shia Islamist organizations. And Hezbollah's very identity is kind of intertwined with the Iranian Revolution and its ideology.
Right.
They're not just allies of convenience, they share a worldview and a common enemy in Israel.
So this adds a whole other layer of complexity. It's not just about territory or resources. It's about these deeply held beliefs and identities.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that ideological connection makes their relationship much stronger and more resilient than a lot of typical proxy relationships.
I'm kind of struck by how this period of covert cooperation during the Iran-Iraq War ultimately sowed the seeds for this far more dangerous dynamic.
Right.
It's almost paradoxical.
It's one of the many paradoxes that define this relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah, by helping Iran survive that war with Iraq, Israel may have inadvertently empowered a much more formidable adversary in the long run.
Wow, it really highlights how even the most well-intentioned actions can have these unintended and often dangerous consequences in this complex geopolitical landscape.
Yeah, and this brings us to a turning point.
Okay.
In the late 1990s and early 2000s, when the conflict between Iran and Israel moved into a much more shadowy and dangerous phase.
Right. This is where we see the emergence of what's often referred to as the shadow war,
Right.
a covert conflict characterized by assassinations, sabotage, and cyber attacks.
Exactly. It's a shadowy world of espionage, covert operations, and plausible deniability, where the lines between peace and war really become blurred.
We've already kind of touched on Israel's covert support for Iran during the Iran-Iraq War. But what prompted this shift toward a more aggressive posture?
Well, several factors kind of contributed to this escalation.
Okay.
On the Israeli side, there was growing concern about Iran's nuclear program,
Right.
which they saw as an existential threat.
Right. The nuclear issue adds a whole other level of complexity to this already tangled web.
Yeah.
But wasn't Iran claiming that its nuclear program was for peaceful purposes?
That was their public stance.
Okay.
But Israel, along with many Western nations, viewed Iran's enrichment of uranium as a clear indication that they were seeking to develop nuclear weapons capability.
So this perceived threat led to Israel adopting a more proactive approach, engaging in these covert actions to disrupt Iran's nuclear program.
Exactly. And those actions took many forms,
Okay.
including sabotage, targeted assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists, and even that sophisticated cyber attack known as Stuxnet.
Ah, Stuxnet.
Yeah.
For those of us who aren't cybersecurity experts,
Right.
can you explain why this particular attack was such a game changer?
Stuxnet was a revelation in the world of cyber warfare.
Okay.
It was a highly sophisticated computer virus, widely believed to be a joint U.S.-Israeli creation that specifically targeted Iran's nuclear facilities.
So instead of bombs and missiles, they used code to inflict damage.
Precisely.
Wow.
Stuxnet infected the software that controlled the centrifuges used to enrich uranium,
Right.
causing them to malfunction and spin out of control, effectively sabotaging Iran's nuclear program from within.
It sounds like something straight out of a science fiction movie.
Right.
You know, using digital weapons to disrupt physical infrastructure.
Yeah, it was a watershed moment.
Yeah.
Demonstrating that destructive potential of cyber warfare on a global stage. And it sent a very clear message to Iran that their nuclear ambitions would be met with, sophisticated and covert resistance.
But Iran wasn't just going to sit back and absorb these attacks, were they?
Right.
How did they respond to this escalation?
Iran retaliated in a number of ways.
Okay.
They ramped up their support for proxy groups like Hezbollah,
Yep.
who launched attacks against Israeli targets.
Yeah.
They also invested heavily in developing their own cyber warfare capabilities.
So this shadow war created a dangerous cycle of escalation, with each side responding to the other's actions, blurring the lines between offense and defense.
Precisely.
Okay.
And this brings us to the present day,
Okay.
where tensions remain very high and that potential for further escalation is a constant concern.
You know, we've been unraveling this incredibly intricate story of Iran and Israel.
Yeah.
And it's clear that this shadow war we discussed
Mhm.
has really cast a long shadow over the entire region.
It has.
Yeah.
It's a conflict that's played out in the shadows for decades, but its impact is all too real.
And as Mazer Bahari has pointed out, the potential for this shadow war to escalate into a full-blown conflict is very real.
Right.
A terrifying prospect.
Yeah, and he's particularly concerned about, the increasing boldness and sophistication of the tactics being used by both sides.
Yeah, for example, the 2024 Israeli airstrike on the Iranian consulate in Damascus was a major escalation.
Right.
It was a direct attack on Iranian sovereign territory, and it killed several people,
Yeah.
including a high-ranking Iranian military official.
It really shattered any pretense of restraint.
Right.
And signaled a willingness to engage in, more overt forms of aggression.
And Iran's response, with Operation True Promise launching hundreds of missiles and drones at targets across Israel, was equally alarming.
Yeah, it was the first time that Iran had directly attacked Israel.
Wow.
And while most of the projectiles were intercepted, it demonstrated a clear intent to retaliate forcefully.
This tit-for-tat escalation is incredibly worrying.
It is.
It feels like we're moving away from this shadowy world of covert operations and towards a more open and potentially catastrophic confrontation.
Right, and that's the danger of this kind of escalation.
Yeah.
Miscalculations and unintended consequences become much more likely
Right.
when you move from covert actions to, direct military engagement.
And Mazer Bahari stresses the human cost of this conflict,
Yeah.
emphasizing that civilians are often caught in the crossfire.
He's right. It's easy to get lost in that geopolitical chess game
Right.
and forget that real people's lives are at stake.
Absolutely. So where do we go from here? Is there any hope for de-escalation, or are we just destined for this future of perpetual conflict between Iran and Israel?
I mean, that's the question that hangs over this entire story, and unfortunately, there are no easy answers.
Mazer Bahari seems to believe that peaceful coexistence between Israel and the current Iranian regime is highly unlikely.
Yeah, he's seen firsthand, that depth of animosity and mistrust that exists between these two sides, and he's not very optimistic about the prospects for a diplomatic breakthrough.
But history has taught us that even the most entrenched conflicts can sometimes take these unexpected turns.
That's true.
I remember those Israeli arms sales to Iran in the 1980s.
Right.
No one could have predicted that.
It's true. Yeah, we can't rule out the possibility of, a sudden shift in the geopolitical landscape or a change in leadership that
Right.
could maybe alter the course of this conflict.
But those are external factors.
Hmm.
What about internal dynamics within Iran itself?
Right.
Could those play a role in shaping the future of this relationship?
I mean, that's a really crucial point.
Yeah.
There's a whole generation of Iranians who have grown up under this regime,
Right.
under this shadow of this conflict.
Right.
And their perspectives, their hopes, their frustrations will undoubtedly shape Iran's future trajectory.
And let's not forget the people of Israel who have lived with this threat of terrorism and war for decades now.
Right.
Their voices and perspectives are equally important in this conversation.
Absolutely. Understanding that human dimension of this conflict,
Mm-hmm.
the hopes and fears of ordinary people on both sides is essential
Right.
if we want to move beyond these simplistic narratives and find a path towards a more peaceful future.
So what can we as informed citizens do with all this
Mhm.
information? It can feel very overwhelming, like this massive, intractable conflict that's beyond our control.
Yeah, I think the first step is awareness,
Right.
which is what we've tried to do today.
Yeah.
By understanding these complexities of the Iran-Israel relationship, its historical roots,
Right.
and these factors driving these current tensions,
Right.
we can start to engage in these, more informed and nuanced discussions.
Knowledge is power.
Right.
The more we understand, the better equipped we are to challenge simplistic narratives and advocate for policies that promote peace and stability.
Exactly. And, it's important to remember that even though this conflict seems intractable,
Yeah.
there are people on both sides working tirelessly for peace and reconciliation.
And their voices may not always be the loudest, but their efforts are crucial
Yeah.
in building bridges and fostering dialogue.
Absolutely. So as we conclude our deep dive today,
Yeah.
we really encourage you to continue exploring this complex and multifaceted issue.
Absolutely.
Read the works of Mazer Bahari, delve into the historical context, and listen to the voices of those who are directly affected by this conflict.
And most importantly, don't lose sight of that human dimension.
Yeah.
Behind all the geopolitical maneuvering, there are real people with real lives,
Mm-hmm.
and their stories deserve to be heard.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.
Until next time.